Welcome to Litpoetry, the podcast where we go on a journey of discovery, reading, analyzing, and discussing great poetry from around the world. Poetry is worth it because the reading and writing of poetry is a revolutionary act that has the potential to transform both the reader and our world.
Welcome to the Lit Poetry Podcast Season 2. My name is James Laidler, Australian poet, writer and your host. In today's episode we'll be gathering around the fragile, flickering light of a poem by Maher Tredinnick. This poem is like a stubborn candle that's only just holding back the encroaching darkness of environmental disaster. The quivering defiance of its flame, sitting above a hot, growing pool of wax, calls out to us. It asks us not only to savour and cherish the light that remains, but to drop to our knees in a state of urgent contrition. This poem is breathtaking in its beauty, in its musicality, and in its celebration of the natural world. Yet it is also completely overwhelming in its prophetic outlook. The poem, titled Litany and Elegy, is in many respects an elegy because it's a lament over the current state of our blasted, pillaged and dying earth. And it is very much a litany because of its reverent and persistent petition for help. I just adore this poem, and I'm very happy to say that Maher Tredinnick will be joining us in a moment to discuss the poem. But before I introduce our guests, let's take a listen to the poem, shall we? May I introduce you to Litany and Elegy by Maher Tredinnick, a poem originally commissioned by Red Room Poetry.
My name is Maher Tredinnick, and this is my poem Litany, an Elegy for the children. Each tongue, it has been wisely said, speaks galaxies, and when a language dies, a world and all that has no other being elsewhere fails. A silence falls where there was song, where there was something known no other lyric grasps. Every species is a world of sound, a solid form of silence said, a body of thought. And with each dialect drowned, each lexicon beached, the world that is a universe of all these knowing realms knows less. The living world grows less alive. And we, who cannot find a patch of ground we do not need to claim, a wildness we do not need to tame, fall deeper alone, the thicker we crowd the biomes. The thinner we shave the ways there are of being on this earth. And thought that flew like shorebirds once around the globe, refusing a single idiom or tide, idles mean abstracted streets and lives off scraps the sated throw away. Our words are made of plastic now and end up in the sea, where stocks of wisdom, overfished and toxic with cliché, dwindle and cease. So what will there be left for us to say by way of remorse? What elegy, excuse or prayer, when the sands along subtropic shores have grown so warm that no more male turtles hatch and make it to the sea? And who will we be, our language atrophied a little more, when Norfolk parakeets run out of trees to roost and fledge? And what will we grasp any more of sin, when all the devils that we know have slipped the earth? And who will teach desire grace, or passion poise, when nothing burns the forests of the night? And when the last savannah elephant has scattered all the bones, what will we recall of grief when our turn comes to let our dear ones go? And how will all the plastic that will never go extinct school the seas in sanctity? What sense will awe begin to make when no blue whales swim the world around? And will our minds remember how to slow our speeding chill when all the whale sharks have passed? Sea otter, snow leopard, curlew, bee. Divinity will be burlesque, and joy will be a sham, when all these bodhisattvas of the floating, hungry, thrumming world have left. O person of the forest, orangutan, who might be any one of us who came down once from boughs, teach us, while there are still woods to be, how to be the woods, not just the trees.
So welcome back to the Lit Poetry Podcast. Mark Tredinnick is a celebrated Australian poet, essayist and teacher. His most recent collection of poems, Walking Underwater, was published in June of this year. His many other works of poetry and prose include A Gathered Distance, Almost Everything I Know, Egret in a Ploughed Field, Blue Wren Cantos, Fire Diary, The Blue Plateau, and The Little Red Writing Book. Since 2003, Mark has published over 200 works, poems, essays, reviews, papers and books. For 25 years he's taught poetry and writing at the University of Sydney, where he was poet in residence in 2018. He is a beloved teacher of writing, literature and ecology, and he's mentored many writers into print. His many honours include two of the world's foremost poetry prizes, the Montreal and the Cardiff. In 2020, Mark was also awarded the Order of Australia Medal for services to literature and education. So welcome, Mark, to the podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Good to be here, James.
That's great. It's really excellent to have you here on the show. And it was thrilling, actually, to get the opportunity to work on this particular poem, put it to music, and to see it sort of bloom into the state it's got to. I just wanted to start, Mark, with maybe you could tell our audience a little bit about yourself, about your poetry, how you came to write this particular poem. It's a very interesting poem, I think.
Sure, James, and thanks for the grace of your words about the poem. So, you find me here on Gundungurra country along the Wingecarribee River in what many listeners would know as Bowral, just southwest of Sydney. I'm a New South Welshman, I suppose. My name is Cornish on my father's side, so I've got minister's oratory in my blood and hymns, Methodist hymns, and I've got on my mother's side German common sense and musicality, actually, a bit of Goethe and whatnot. Mum's a musician and a school teacher. My parents are both elderly now, and I'm lucky still to have them around. They live quite close to me here, actually, in Bowral too, and their dad's approaching 90 now. So, yeah, that's where I am now, and I grew up in one of the suburbs of Sydney. We have an Epping as well. That's where I grew up. It's in the seat of Bennelong, a famous seat in Australian politics, actually, and the kind of person Howard was for good and ill, John Howard, it was his seat, is very much the kind of Australia I think I grew up in. And the way that seat has changed, which he lost, of course, when he lost office, is also the way Australia's changed. Part of Sydney has become heavily occupied by Indian and Chinese folks, and there's now the Macquarie Technology Park and Macquarie University just up the road. It's not the kind of Bible Belt, lower middle class, very white Australia that I grew up in, without very much sense of whose country it really was in the first place. So I grew up among turpentines and sandstones. That's my dog in the background. Dante, a poet.
Just giving us a bit of ambience. It's great.
Yeah. So I'm approaching 60, James, so I can't believe it. Last time I looked, I was still just 21, but it's funny how it goes. I do feel my age in certain ways, in others not at all, and I think poetry in certain ways can kind of keep you young, or it keeps your soul young, or it keeps you in track with your soul's age, which is both ancient and about 13, I think, at the same time.
Yeah. So I find that fascinating. You mentioned that you have a Methodist background.
It's my grandfather, James, was Wesley. His name was Wesley.
Oh, okay. Yes.
So, if they christen you Wesley Tredinnick, you don't have any choice. You can. It's interesting that you hit upon that, and interesting that I mentioned it. I guess it does help a reader understand some of what goes on in my work. I think.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think there are certain sort of maybe even Christian allusions in the language of the poem itself. I mean, the fact that it's called a litany, an elegy, is a clear cue there. What also interests me is what I find with your poetry in particular is its musicality. And, in particular in this poem, I think there's a really rich use of things such as alliteration and assonance, which we'll probably touch upon later. But I'm wondering if that's actually partly connected to your mother's music and this background of hymns, and because, how does a poet actually develop that ear or that love or that musicality? And it seems like you gravitate towards that in your own writing. So would you say that there is a heritage there? Is that part of the genesis of those qualities in your work?
For certain. These things are always somewhat mysterious, of course, aren't they? There's no question there's music in the family. I also grew up with my mother's mother in the house, and my grandma, Rachel. And grandma's she played the piano a lot in the house, and her entire repertoire was the hymn book. That was it. Like, she knew no music that wasn't church music. Both of her daughters, one of whom was my mother, have gone on to be quite sophisticated musicians, but still sacred music is at the heart of their practice. My mother's an organist and a conductor and chorister, and she conducts the U3A choir down here in Bowral. But I grew up. It was, as I said in a recent interview, it's not strange for me. The idea of sermons is not a strange thing. That's a familiar thing, and also what teachers do to prepare for class, and also the idea of Bach being played in the next room and singing harmony and thinking rhythmically. And we all had instruments too. I played the cello. We had not much choice in the matter. I love the cello very much. In fact, someone once, Linda Rogers, a Canadian poet with whom I travelled in Canada after the Montreal Prize, said to me when I mentioned that thing about the cello, she said, "Now I get it." She said, "I get the long lines, the long kind of bowings, and the baritone kind of voice and the rhythm." So look, poetry in a way for me is the discourse that refuses the reductive. It won't allow apprehension or expression to be reduced to one thing or abstracted.
That's right. Yeah.
So I always resist simple explanations.
And I assume too that your style over the years has morphed and changed and evolved in different ways as you've added more strings to your bow, to use that analogy.
Yeah, certainly. It's funny that sort of it happens to you, doesn't it, as a creative? I'm dedicated to not plagiarizing myself mostly, but that means that I want to find fresh ways to say things line by line. But there are moves that we learn to make, which are our sort of signature, I suppose. And one thing that has come on, James, actually, in my writing, if you look from the first collection, which was Fire Diary, to Walking Underwater, which is my fourth full collection, you'll see through particularly the last two books, A Gathered Distance and Walking Underwater, a lot more work that is blank verse, a lot of iambic pentameter. Litany, you'll have picked up, is actually heptameter. It's pretty iambic, so it's got one of the things that works through it, which is beautifully sort of echoed in that music you've put underneath it, is like a left hand. It's like the left hand on the piano, like what do we call that? Like an obligato, kind of holding together what doesn't want to hold together. It's kind of holding coherently a chaos that wants to break out.
Yeah, which I think takes us perhaps into the heart of some of the themes you're trying to sort of hone in on there, though, that tension between the rhythm and the chaos that's about to sort of explode on the stage. It's really, it's a fascinating poem. And I know on a phone conversation to me, you actually mentioned there's some interesting qualities in the actual structure. And of course, I'm coming in on this with a blank slate. And I suppose that would be an interesting place to start with the structure and how the structure is set out and how it actually maybe lends itself to the meaning, reinforces the meaning of the poem, what you're trying to do with it. All I could say, what I did detect, and this is as a reader, of course, creating my own meaning, I suppose, but I did see a movement, and I'm not sure if this is a part of the actual structure, but from language to song to thought to action. That's what I was seeing in the progression, but I could be really missing the mark there, I'm not sure. But anyway, over to you about the structure. You've already told us a little bit about rhythm.
So it's, in my mind, what it is, I said heptameter before, I mean hexameter, so six beats per line. Sustained for, I don't know, I haven't actually ever counted the lines. It feels like it's about 40 or something. And the poem, as you mentioned at the outset, was a poem commissioned by the Red Room Poetry Company for a series called Extinction Elegies. And I was there at the ground floor, well, not quite at the ground floor. The thing derived from some research work at Durham University. And they partnered with the Red Room, and then Tamron spoke to me quite early on about how we might do it and which poets we might include. And of course then the other poets had written their pieces, or so she said, and I hadn't. I'm always running late with these things. So I then wrote this thing, and I didn't write quite what I'd intended to write, which was that I might dwell upon one animal that was facing extinction. The reason why I didn't is because I'd become quite arrested by the work actually that Red Room and others are doing. Curly Saunders, the Australian Indigenous poet and storyteller, had been curating some work at Red Room on the conservation of Indigenous languages in their poetic expression. So those ideas were on my mind, and the thing that gets the poem going is the thought expressed in the opening line, which says, of course, each tongue, it has been wisely said, speaks galaxies. So there's your 6 beats. I was working quite strong rhythmic, like metrics through those years. This poem was written in 2017 or 18, somewhere around there. So I began in my mind with exploring extinction in the first place as the extent, what is lost, all that's lost when human cultures, particularly languages, are lost. Thinking of say indigenous languages, which are under threat here, and many have been lost in the world, but also then more generally, which is where the poem goes into what happens when a more humane idiom, when a lyric discourse in which humanity and mystery are kept alive, what happens when that gets lost and every second word on television is impact or facilitate or whatever.
Yeah, it certainly made me think about that connection between life and language. That life is in some ways an embodiment of language, that, it expresses a message in the way we, if you go back to the Christian message of words becoming flesh, this embodiment. And so, on one level, I read the poem very directly, especially in the opening in some ways, related to our physical world with its creatures in it and all that sort of stuff, but it really sort of cascaded from there into cultures and language and a bunch of other stuff that I thought was really fascinating. And again, I'm only really sort of, I'm doing a disservice to probably what you were thinking here. But yeah, I'd really be keen to hear about that connection between language, life, what you were thinking.
Well, in here's how I understood it, James. I think in the beginning I was using human languages, human discourses, and culture more broadly, almost as a metaphor for animal species. And then when I touched on the animal species, they stand in the poem, I think, as an equal metaphor for the human ones. And what underlies that is that we're all connected, that the loss of an animal species means about the same kind of tragedy and loss of value in the world as the loss of an idiom, or more broadly a language or a culture. Then the poem moves on, having reached that point where I use the line about our words are made of plastic now and end up in the sea, which is of course a political moment, really, though lyrically turned, which plays of course on the idea of plastics in the sea and that terrible pollution, all that's put at risk, all the life, including our own, that's put at risk by that, but uses that also as a metaphor for the plasticization of language, for the flight of kind of humanity. That's why it's in the poem. And I think the outcomes, to use some of the language, are connected here. What we do to our language, we do to each other. What we do to each other, we tend to do to land and to the animals in the land. It's a kind of exploitive, right? An exploitive or instrumental attitude that one takes in all those arenas, and it amounts to the same thing, which is the tragedy of terrible loss and all of the impoverishment that causes.
Yeah. I get that sense of the homogenizing of different elements coming together and being pressed into this loss of culture, because things there's a sameness that in that way, which I suppose speaks to our sort of industrialised way of exploiting the earth. And you talk about biomes and really implying the stripping back of the diversity of biomes. So what we see in the physical is then reflected also in the cultural. You relate shorebirds with ideas, human ideas,
yes,
of course. Yeah, so I find that connection really fascinating. So this is clearly pressing some buttons on, I imagine, things that you're quite passionate about or concerns you have when you're looking at culture, our culture in particular. Do you want to talk about what was going on there with you?
Yeah, I mean...
Big ideas, I know, but...
Yeah, well, actually, at the end of... I've written a couple of things lately, pieces of prose, essays that capture a number of these concerns of mine. One I published in Eureka Street a couple of years ago, and I called it I Am Nobody, Who Are You?, which is the Emily Dickinson poem. And that's about the idea behind that. And the context for that is a kind of rather, in my mind, shrill discourse about identity, about appropriation. Things of great importance argued about so shrilly that the conversation seemed hypocritical to me. Anyway, my point is, in that essay, there is something deeper than identity, and what it is we struggle to find words for, but it's been the purpose of spiritual disciplines, wisdom literatures, and poetry and literature and the other arts, to attempt to honor it, and that you might call it the self. An identity is a lesser thing. The level of the self, of course, each of us is at the same time, in my mind, both unique and absolutely equal, because we're all equal in our uniqueness. It seems to me very important that we keep a literature alive that performs that function, that keeps resonating.
That sense of solidarity and connectedness that we have as a human family, and yet it also celebrates this uniqueness. I mean, it's interesting because it seems to me in our culture today that the dilemma we face is that there is debate around things like identity politics, but it's such a shallow debate often, where people establish their camps and aren't actually willing to put much energy into really thinking through. And you're saying that we're going deeper here than identity. This is not just about identity. This is at a more spiritual level. And certainly, that was one of the questions I had for you, because the poem, does seem quite spiritual. And I suppose I even have some questions. Does that have implications about you as well, like as a person? Like, do you meditate, or is something of you wrapped up in the poem? Yeah?
I think a friend of mine once said years ago, he said, "Mark, you and I are men of a religious disposition," which I think is quite right. Like, I actually, the other thing that I wrote recently, I have an essay at the back of Walking Underwater, which actually speaks to some concerns I have about the attempt to, it seems to me, colonize literature for politics, for political purposes. And even when I like the political outcomes, I hate the colonization, because it's not right. The politics poetry performs, and we need it to perform, is a refusal of stereotypical conceptions of each other. And stereotypes belong in certain categories, but poetry actually insists that to live well with each other, we must live in a place that's got some connection to our the thing I was talking about before, the kind of uniqueness, and also to some sense of the eternal and that which is mysterious.
Yeah, but I imagine as an academic, and a poet, that's not necessarily an easy line to take, because, well, in academic circles and in some poetry circles as well, I mean, there is materialism is very much a central tenet for a lot of people, and so credence towards considering aspects that go beyond materialism to ask questions that perhaps can't be answered is not necessarily a comfortable place. It leaves you open for criticism and all sorts of things.
And what's hardest to resist, James, is feeling defensive about it. I find I get cranky because I feel as though the establishment, which is the academy and most the poetry scene, like it's months since I've read a poem from Poets.org, the American Academy of Poets thing, that was anything resembling a kind of lyric poem of much merit, but all of them are absolutely on point. Like, they're all on point about, a kind of traumatic childhood and, kind of exclusion. And it seems to me, and I get really cross about it, because I think we're losing connection with what poetry is and what it's for, which is not to say those discourses, those points, those politics and that anthropology, those causes don't need to be pursued. They do, and poetry can probably pursue them. But on balance, I find there is a disconnect between the caliber of the politics and the caliber of the poem. But I love what you say about materialism. In one sense, I am a materialist, and that is that I believe as an article of faith, really, in the physicality of the human body and of the world outside the head. The more than merely human world, architecture and the senses. And poetry, for me, fails too if it doesn't engage the senses and doesn't remember the world beyond the concepts in our heads. So I guess I think poetry's always done that, but I'm with William Carlos Williams when he says no ideas but in things. And of course, then people go, but hang on, Mark, and read my poem, and I'm quite bardic. Like, I do quite like a poem that has something to say, but if you're going to say it and a kind of call to action, then the challenge is to not fall out of the lyric realm with that. In other words, keep your rhythm and find a metaphor and make an utterance that can be understood at least three different related ways.
Well, and in a simplistic way, I suppose you could see two major camps in poetry well, one is that sort of metaphorical, sort of William Carlos Williams inspired notion that you mentioned before. And again, it gets back to your poem about the embodiment of ideas in living creatures, and how that actually in its own way does work. Poetry is a mystery, isn't it? It's a very powerful device, but it is it's about narrative, it's about story. It sits in the material world in a very discordant, sort of uncomfortable, refreshing sort of way.
Yeah. I think people people kind of hate on poetry because they know it's dangerous and powerful. So part of me kind of likes that.
Yes. It's interesting because I've got quite a few, a lot of materialist friends. Me, I'm sort of maybe sitting somewhere else. So I think, talking poetry and talking in this sort of realm does, it elicits uncomfortable notions in people, I think.
It does really unsettles people. Even to mention the S word, the spiritual word, in any Australian context, particularly an academic one, is to get all sorts of strange looks. So I've been at pains to develop ways of saying what I think that might be about. And one thing I think the spiritual means to me is that refusal, a resistance against anything reductive. And anything that is ugly in its utterance is bound to be wrong, is another thing. And a fair bit of what the materialists have to say just sounds really ugly and inadequate to me. I don't know if you know the Canadian writer Jan Zwicky. Jan's got a book called, I've got actually up there on my shelf, I've got Wisdom and Metaphor, and another book of hers is called A Lyric Philosophy. She's retired now from that, she's a poet full time, but she says effectively, that what we've lost is a sense of what the lyric means, what the lyric is as a discourse, as a set of values, and as a way of proceeding to have a conversation. And it's many things. Of course, it's the musical. So to emphasize, as you have done, your apprehension of the rhythm and the musicality in my work is to say something about its lyricism. But it's more than that. It's a philosophical thing. Of course, that in many ways music is the means to get the lyric data, if you like, the lyric data of existence acknowledged and voiced without kind of killing it off.
Well, I think that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, I'm attracted to poetry because it's a vehicle that doesn't necessarily give answers, it opens questions. I think it's a springboard, it takes you on a journey, it challenges you, and it can change from day to day, and I'm sure you've done this where you open up a poem one day and you read it, and then a week later it becomes something else for you, and there's a mystery in that, but there's something life-giving in that process of uncovering, and that you have to accept on some level the uncertainty that goes with that too. But that's, I don't know, I feel more alive in that than just putting all the ideas in boxes and saying this is how the world works. That doesn't satisfy me completely.
No, well, it's got to be wrong for a start. I mean, it's just got to be wrong. There's hardly anything. Science tells us that too, doesn't it? Like, there's hardly anything we know for an absolute certainty. So it's very unlikely the social scientists are at the head of the game there. I just wanted to say one thing there, James, too, because it is absolutely true that a good poem deserves and rewards you for multiple readings, and you'll get different depths and ideas and suggestions from it each time. It's true of one's own work too, but there is a good kind of openness and a bad kind of openness.
Oh, yes.
The bad kind of openness is the one from students too, and I'm working with a lot, where you just, like, it's just incapable of actually meaning anything to anyone except the person who wrote it. And even for them, they sometimes say, oh, I didn't quite know, like what I meant. And I'm going, well, why not? So there has to be, I think, in a good poem, there is something you take that's substantial, that kind of feels as though it can hold you at a first reading. And maybe this is a different way of saying the same thing. That the poet knows, or that they had at least some things in mind. Well, like, for example, where is this happening and what is happening to whom, and is there a background, or is, how am I to imagine this? And that's what I meant before when I was getting at that kind of materialism. I trade in my teaching with a Chinese idea called Xing, X-I-N-G. X-I-N-G, we translate that as, that says effectively, no work of art will ever be any good if 50% of that work is not what they call the scene. So 50% of everything needs to be the background, if you like. Poetry foregrounds background. So that leaves you 50% for what's called the feeling, which is the ideation, of course, and the plot and the narrative, what you called the story before. And something about that equivalence is critical. I think it plays through Litany, actually. where when you're reading about the fish, you actually in yourself are feeling the thoughts, and when you're hearing the thoughts, you're feeling the fish and the tiger and so on. And only when you get close to 50-50, it's a very practical device actually, can you set up that resonance, and it's a lyric resonance, I think. So I am a kind of spiritual materialist.
Getting back to the poem, there's a number of questions I would like to ask you. We sort of touched upon the idea that it's an ecological poem, but broadening that definition of ecology in a way to cultural, spiritual, into the world of thoughts. But I suppose the question I have is, it seems like the poem sort of challenges or flies in the face of the fairly dominant idea, I'd say, in the Western world of that we are, self-made people, individuals. And we should understand ourselves through our own self-actualization and that sort of thing. Particularly, I think, in the last line or two of the poem, there seems to be a very strong and powerful message about this. But I suppose I'd like to ask you, is this something you were actually intending, or have I completely missed the point here, which I well might have?
No, I'll put you out of your misery there, James. You have not missed the point. And I must confess, I didn't overthink the finish. Here's another thing, I suppose, just to hark back quickly to what we were saying before. A poem needs, I think, to be written with both heart and head, and body and voice, actually, all things at once. And if one predominates, it tends to run off the rails. So too much thinking disconnected from heart, and the felt sense, as the phenomenologists say. Phenomenology I like. It's the one philosophical discourse I find seems to speak something that resembles the truth. So I guess I felt like in the end I end up with the orangutan because I have before that the end of the litany. Like, it's called Litany, and of course it lists many species in danger after doing all that other work that you've described first. But then I get to the bit that goes sea otter, snow leopard, curlew, bee, divinity will be burlesque, etc., etc. And then I go back to the orangutan, which means person of the forest, which of course is quite delightful metaphorically, because we think of ourselves as people. We know that we've come in evolutionary terms from the trees and from among the apes, and we're now putting the orangutan in great danger because of the way that we so selfishly inhabit, tracts of land and knock down rainforest and so on. And
so is there a call here to a non-anthropocentric?
So it all comes, I guess, from an ecological perspective on the world. Ecology is both, I guess, a body of knowledge, a way of seeing that I have, that I'm quite invested in. I did my doctoral work in what you would call eco-criticism, and one of the ways I get a bit cross about where we've taken the cultural debates of recent years is away from the ecological. I mean, for goodness sake, we spent so much time trying to get the humanities to remember the earth, only to find after a couple of years of a bit of kind of a nod in the direction of the ecological, the humanities have turned back on themselves, and we can only ever consider the human in and that, we're great and everything, but we belong, in the world on earth with geology and landscape. So you can tell I have a passion about that, what ecology beyond its own world teaches us metaphorically is that nothing is understood atomically, like in itself alone. Ecology offers the suggestion that we might understand some deep truths if we look for the interrelationships, the relationship between. And so there's an idea that is articulated, I suppose, at the end, and it is a call, as you're suggesting, to action, that we might begin, that maybe we've wandered so far into dangerous territory for the whole planet because we lost a sense of our own belonging, our own kinship.
And so we need to reframe the way we understand and conceptualize the world, and and our
ourselves,
connection
and our obligations and rights. The kind of the set of the play of obligate to whom and what do we owe responsibilities. And it has been the mainstream of the we that I'm talking about in the poem. Either, I suppose, mainstream Western capitalist thinking, which has been which bulldozes tracts of land to make a profit and to build to build dwellings for people, but has no account to make of things beyond the human and the social. It has actually no way of even valuing things beyond the human, and the human that it values strikes me as such an appallingly narrow understanding of what a human life is, let alone a life that isn't human. So yes, it's a call to reconceptualize ourselves now.
Yeah, and I love that image that you leave the poem on. How to be. It's very simple, but how to be the woods, not just the trees, which speaks about the problem with individualism and this sense that we actually belong to a bigger other, and we're nurtured in that space together, and we're impoverished and we atrophy if we're just some sort of lone tree in some field sort of struggling against the elements. The forest there's a richness to the forest, and that's our natural setting that we should be moving towards.
That's right. So as in itself, of course, as an image, it homes us again in terms of human evolution. It's where we came from. But as a metaphor, of course, as you're picking up there, it says, well, how would it be if we conceptualized ourselves as a part of a whole? And what if our belonging were the whole, not the part? If we weren't just the star, but the whole constellation? If that's who we are, that puts a different spin on things in terms of what is right and what is beautiful, and what we owe responsibilities to, as well as consolation. It is a consoling idea, I think, against the predominant Western view, which I still have. You can't really shake it off, that we're here alone. And it's at the heart of, the epidemic of loneliness and depression in the West as well, too, I think, is that the downside of self-reliance, I suppose, is that, in that you come in alone, you're here alone, there is no reality or ecology of meaning beyond the confines, not even of my body, but just of my identity or this intellectual conception of oneself. That's a very lonely place to occupy. I've occupied it too. Most of us have been through times of trouble.
And it often sort of lends itself to a direction of nihilism, which is fraught with problems. And so I suppose, you're more concerned with finding a way to resist that pull towards nihilism, to find meaning that's more than the self. I find that interesting. One of the questions I do have, though, because you've been so involved with ecology, is that, and one of the problems I see in society, and I'm not sure how you address this in this poem or elsewhere, but it's just the sense of apathy and disengagement from the actual issue, and that can be, I suppose, multi-layered. That it could be from fatigue, like people's exposure to the issue, it's just too overwhelming, so that they disengage from that point, from pain and distraction. There's so many things, but that's what concerns me sometimes with poetry and whatever, that you can write poetry and it hits an audience or a demographic, a specific, but it misses fundamental cultural change if that's part of, if poets are political, and we actually, part of our whole gig is to create political change. How does the message go beyond people who are already sympathetic to that?
Well, one thing I know is that if there are things that need to be said, they should be said. Silence isn't going to help in that space, and despair is not really an option. So I remember Judy Beveridge asked me when I first was beginning in poetry, would I write poems if I knew no one would ever read them? And for a poet, that's a really simple question. The answer is just yes. So why yes? Because something some truthfulness is pressing itself into the world through you, and you have an obligation to get it said. What happens to it after that is beyond our control, really. But certainly there are works that have changed my life and changed my direction. So it's possible that one's own work might do that. But even if it didn't, I think something about, we're back to the spiritual, and I don't want to be too mystical here, but it seems to me quantum physics tells us that, reality is a set of frequencies and vibrations, and I'd rather make a few of them good. I'd rather work at the rhythm.
In fact, I think Einstein actually said that, which was quite controversial too. He talked about there's no material reality, it's just wavelengths. He said a lot of things, of course, across the spectrum,
But, so for that reason too, I remember I was great friends with the American writer Barry Lopez, who died at Christmas. Barry's a nature writer. Some people would know Arctic Dreams and so on. I remember early on when Barry's work was so beautiful to me and so meaningful. It mattered. The way that a human language matters, to get back to theme, and a species, it mattered that much. And I remember saying to him when I met him, Barry, the world really is that much more beautiful because you're in it writing what you write, and it's not reducible again to whether anybody ever reads it. It's important that we try to get people to read it, of course, and the way that it works is some people get not just, you touched on some points earlier about the poem, James, and we talked a bit about the lyric. It's possible, it's only possible if a lyric poem is written, that there will be some people like you, for example, who will feel that feeling. That's important right there at that moment. And then you go talk to your kids and teach your class and conduct yourself, make some different decisions.
Yeah, so the connections we often can't see. We kind of live in hope that these things happen. But I think you're right, and in particular, when I look at society, and I think one of the biggest problems I see is with sort of rampant ego, that because we're selves and we're often driven by our own selfish desires. But when you get wrapped up in an idea or a poem or something that's outside you, it's big, and the idea is beautiful, and it almost helps you to escape the prison of yourself in a way and get wrapped up in something universal that's bigger. Dostoevsky said the world will be saved by beauty, I think, in Brothers Karamazov. And I think that sort of notion, and that can do work, that pure good idea, maybe that's the reason why we do poetry, or maybe why you do poetry in your best sense, when we all get all prone to ego and all the rest of it, but there is, we know, we glimpse that, and there's a memory of it that lingers with us forever, I imagine.
Yeah, it's true. And what you're getting at there too with Dostoevsky is dead on. It's form. There are many levels of this, like there is the odd poem that will touch hundreds of thousands or millions of people all at the same time, like that poem, which I don't think is a great poem. It's a perfectly okay poem that was spoken at the inauguration of Joe Biden. And it's, even though I've got my own small qualms with it, it's altogether a fantastic thing, because many people who never read a poem were taken by that, and you see them going through the sort of experience you've just described, where it's just like they can't put words on why they're moved and why that makes the world more beautiful and themselves both more humble and more useful at the same time in it. But other poems will be read by just the one person, or they'll be read 100 years later or something. Like you can never know when the thing might just work, but you do have to trust that poetry kind of matters and will make a difference.
A few things we could probably pick up on too. I did want to look at, I think there's some really amazing language, and I would encourage people, if they get the chance, you can type the name of this poem into internet and have a look on Red Room. There's some beautiful lines, I think. There's one line that says, every species is a world of sound, a solid form of silence said, a body of thought, and with each dialect drowned, each lexicon beached. The world that is a universe, and it goes on, but in particular, like the alliteration and the assonance through there. A lot of your sentences and word and the sounds are rich and elongated, but that when it gets to lexicon beached, that the consonants on the B there is it just like hit me like a train. I could hear that language sort of slapping down on the sand and just going nowhere. It's interesting. A small phrase like that can be so powerful and so evocative. And I suppose I would encourage readers to really try to find that in poetry. What are those little phrases, little words, techniques? Yeah, do you want to tell me about that? How did it feel when you wrote those particular words? What was going on in your mind? Am I actually picking up on things that you actually thought in the process?
Oh, sure, but they happen. They happen. You can make them happen more reliably by going to school and reading some poems and working out and remembering that assonance and alliteration and wordplay, because there's wordplay going on in there too. I've got whales in mind, of course, a little bit with lexicon, beached and drowned. So I've got kind of stranded,
like an extended metaphor, sort of
extended metaphor, right to the end of it. But there is a kind of play that gets underway in the composition. It doesn't look much like play from the outset, because I can't, like, that's a very fluent line now. Even I can see how that flows. I didn't struggle too much with the poem, but I can't remember that came especially, like, it's not just I'm in some drug-induced stage and out it comes. I actually work it quite hard, but I think what's happening is that psychologically I can, through language, be drawn into what I call sometimes deep speech, like a deep clean, It's like deep speech, and language leads you there, and trusting that all the elements of language need to lead you there, not just thinking, not just narrative, but also especially the lyric qualities of it.
Yeah, it's like the Chinese whatever word you said before.
The thing.
Yeah, so some of it's landscape, sometimes there's thinking, but there's these other moments that sort of break through, which I think is really good, because there'll be poets who are listening to this, and sometimes getting feeling a little bit negative about their work, and so that sort of tapestry that you're painting about a poem, I think, is a really beautiful idea of the nuances that you experience through it, and also, like, because if that line, if that caliber of line, I think, was through the whole thing, the poem wouldn't work. You would lose something.
Yeah, no, it's true. Actually, that's the thing I remember very early on when I was just beginning, and I think I'd won the Gwen Harwood, which is a lovely poet prize to win for your first prize. I love Gwen Harwood, but I was putting some things in the Blake. There's a Blake reference in the poem too. I'm sure
there is. Forest of the Night.
Forest of the Night.
Yeah.
About the tiger, which is of course, what happens, I think, in a poem is that I'll get back to that point in a minute, but kind of everything, if you can concentrate on craft, everything that you've lived and been and thought and lost, and every field of metaphor and lover you've had and whatnot, kind of turns up in a way and suggests themselves as possible ways to get something said. And craft is the discipline you need to focus on. You can overthink all that background stuff, but you almost can't overthink rhythm, rightness, beauty of rhythm, and adequacy of sound for the kind of content. But where I was going with that is it is necessary to kind of work flaws like wabi-sabi into art. The wabi-sabi philosophy is my next collection actually is called A Beginner's Guide, and it's titled from a poem of mine called A Beginner's Guide to Wabi-sabi, which is like the idea of imperfection. And there ought to be in a poem, you have to have some moments where it doesn't exactly go slack, but you tell a joke, or levity and gravity counts, or you wander off a little bit and just have an easygoing line of ideation or scene setting.
I think Dickinson is a great example of that with her poetry. Such a strong rhythm in a lot of her work, but all these weird moments that just kind of go slap you on the face.
What's that in for? When I was entering the Blake that year, I remember I had a poem that was called, it's got a question in its title actually, it's called Have You Seen? Have you seen the way the trees, that sclerophyll fraternity on the mountain, or however it... And a fellow poet had read it and criticised me for wandering off in the middle of the poem. And it does kind of wander off a little bit. But I had decided to enter 4 poems, and that was the 5th. And I left it on the desk, and I went up to the house. And being stubborn, I thought, bugger it, I like that poem. I'm going to put it in. And it was the one that won the whole
there you go.
prize. So, like, there you go. Like, it might not win every year, but it is one of the qualities that I think readers don't even know they love in a poem, that actually it goes on a slightly weird excursion.
And do you find, is that part of your poetic experience, that sometimes you're doing something, you go, you know what, I'm just going to do something that I feel really uncomfortable with. I'm just going to see what happens if I do this.
A little bit. Like, I think of it as the strange idea that you want to censor out. That's the one. And you go, hang on, just hold with it, stick it in, you can take it out later. Yeah, it has become something. I think that was a critical point for me in moving from never finishing poems. Particularly with poetry, it was a thing, and other work, but poetry especially, where I had to trust that I could go with the strange thing, the thing that I was censoring out, because this is a point for our times, really. I suppose the very thing, you touched on this before too, where you're saying something that doesn't conform with the rubric and the code of the moment, that doesn't use the appointed language, that isn't materialist, that doesn't use the word discourse and meta in every other one of its pieces of phrasing. It's precisely because it doesn't that you want it, because it's likely possibly to be an articulation of who you alone are, and that's what each reader actually is at the end of the day, is someone who isn't caught by any of those categories. And so if you allow that into the work, I mean, some of it's shit and doesn't work, but
absolutely.
You've got to give it a go, I think. Otherwise the poem doesn't really fly.
I love the reference to Forest of the Night. That really sort of, and I'm thinking, I love that poem. It's had a big effect on me in my life, and I'm thinking wonder, but I'm also thinking the terrors of industrialisation. There's so many levels that poem sort of wakes in me. But I do have a question, because there was a line that I just couldn't get my head around, and it's and what will we grasp any more of sin when all the devils that we know have slipped the earth? And I actually spoke with a friend about this line, and we came up with all sorts of harebrained ideas about what it was, and I was going, is it talking about, what's topical at the moment, all these rich millionaires wanting to fly the earth and start a new earth, but that's such disregard for the created world.
No, it's a simpler thing, James. I actually had in mind the Tasmanian devils. So
there you go.
If you go back to the poem, you can see what I'm doing is I'm listing. This is me actually fulfilling the brief. The brief is a poem that is a litany of animals. So you've got elephants there and blue whales, and they're all species that are endangered. So Slip the Earth is just another way to get said. What happens? What we'll lose? I'm thinking. You see, along these lines, I'm going. When we lose the tigers, we lose some wisdom about how to be sexy and restrained at the same time, and contained violence and the beauty of that. When we lose the blue whales, what do we lose then? So my mind was thinking through trying to articulate something that would be lost if a certain species was lost. And I thought, devils, they're called devils, and they're called devils because of their color and because of their behavior. And there's a kind of naughtiness and kind of savagery on behalf of what of what you hunger for, but also of your family, that would be lost. So you were all rather delightfully overthinking it, James, I think.
Yes, well, that's interesting. But it's interesting that word devils, I think, is an immediate trigger to think of human beings. Yeah, so that's quite curious.
Yes. I mean, and
I wonder how many people would actually read it that way and stumble on that and think, what are we talking about here? Humans?
But there's a thing too, that gets back to what you said before about the poem. It's delightful that it opened up those other contemplations.
It was actually a fun conversation I had with this person I was speaking to about it. We were talking about Jeff Bezos or whatever it is, and who's the other guy?
The Virgin.
Tesla guy, and wanting to colonize Mars, and it was a complete tangent, and really missed the mark on we thought that, but it was a fun conversation.
I mean, the thing is, there is something a bit there's divination involved in poetry writing. It's the other term I'm using. I mean, forgive us, all you materialists out there, all of these terms, but like shamanistic in a way. And I think Seamus Heaney used to refuse to call it my poem. He would say the poem, meaning the poem that came. And I know that under certain kinds of analyses, that's just a mystical woo-woo kind of notion, but it's how it feels to me. Like you have, your role is to get out of your own way, as he said, and not to stuff it up, and to do the hard work of craft, application of craft, and ideation and everything else. But when you do, grace, here's another term, grace, sometimes happens. It's that which they say you haven't earned it, but in a sense you do earn, as you earn grace in the Presbyterian Calvinist tradition through prayer and good works, and in the Buddhist tradition too. In poetry, it's kind of the good work of the discipline of turning up and refusing every cliche that suggests itself to you. Sometimes when that happens, you get some wisdom that you didn't have. It's not an idea that you could have come up with on your own, but nonetheless it manifests, and there it is.
Yeah, and I know that feeling writing myself, and you have those moments. It feels very luxurious, actually, and maybe people who don't write very much don't know that there's this really enjoyable experience when you write something and it's bubbling away and it seems to come quite mysteriously to you. Not always, a lot of the time it's hard work, but and what a joy that is, and how terribly in contrast when you actually go and put a piece of work out there and you become self-conscious of it, how it kind of almost destroys the process. Like the creation is very different from audience, unfortunately.
It's actually
sad, really.
You mean this, I suppose, but it's very difficult even to ever read one of my own poems and feel as though I've caught the poem. I never feel as though I quite have, and I've learned that that's just a wonderful thing.
That's a good thing, I think.
That is a really healthy, good thing. There's way more there than you'll ever manage to bring to the microphone on any given occasion.
And do you get a sense of joy when people bring their own interpretations and you can understand and see those readings and go, wow, that's cool, that's amazing?
Yeah, sure, of course, it's a cliche to say humbling, but it does it does humble you to realize what's been achieved, if I can put it that way, you've had a part in it. But yeah, there was something when people say, like someone just this morning posted one of the poems from is it from Walking Underwater? Yeah, it is, called When the Panic, as this beautiful sequence of just the couplets. She took the couplets, and it's on Insta, just on Insta. It's this thing, and I thought, wow, imagine having a life where one day, actually, I wrote that poem in so much pain, and poetic craft really saved me, I think, as well as produced a poem which ends up feeling quite so much more secure and sure, but still humble, I think, not in an imagined kind of way, sure, James, but imagine living a life where you could make such a thing and then see this eventuality, and let alone the thing that you've done with the work. It does make you feel as though you've been blessed.
Oh, well, I'm glad. I'm very glad that you said that. And look, that's probably a really good place for us to finish, because we've been talking for over an hour now. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, Mark. Fantastic. And hopefully I'll get a chance to do another one of your poems in the future. Yeah, and I think I've got your one of your ex-students, Ali Whitelock, coming up, I think, on the next interview in a couple of weeks after this one. So fascinating. A very, very different poem, very, very different style. Yeah. But very powerful.
And as I said to you, we're not unconnected. Ali's a good friend, and she's come into her poetic craft, which is, as you say, vastly different from mine. But we've conversed about sonnets and form and so on. So that's a beautiful thing too, isn't it? How the same inspirations can yield such radically different, outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, James.
Thank you again, and Mark, good to see you in the future.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
So it's time to wrap up this week's episode and say goodbye. Next week we'll be looking at the rather haunting poetic masterpiece The Hollow Men by T.S. Eliot. To stay notified of upcoming episodes, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. And of course, a beautiful video clip of today's poem, Litany and Elegy, is also available for viewing on our YouTube channel. For other resources, visit our website at www.litpoetry.com. Litpoetry has got some excellent content planned for the weeks ahead. Aside from featuring classic poems and poets from the past, every second episode in Season 2 will be interviewing a prominent contemporary poet and featuring some of their work. Indeed, for each of these poets, Litpoetry has been hard at work producing a video poem of one of their pieces to discuss. This is a very exciting format, and the discussion that springs from these audio-visual interpretations of their work should make for interesting listening. In a fortnight's time, we'll be featuring a poem by Ali Whitelock, so make sure you tune in. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Thanks for dropping by. I'll see you next time.
My name is Mark Tredinnick, and this is my poem Litany, an Elegy, for the children. Each tongue, it has been wisely said, speaks galaxies, and when a language dies, a world and all that has no other being elsewhere fails. A silence falls where there was song, where there was something known no other lyric grasps. Every species is a world of sound, a solid form of silence said, a body of thought, and with each dialect drowned, each lexicon beached, the world that is a universe of all these knowing realms knows less. The living world grows less alive. And we, who cannot find a patch of ground we do not need to claim, a wildness we do not need to tame, fall deeper alone, the thicker we crowd the biomes, the thinner we shave the ways there are of being on this earth. And thought that flew like shorebirds once around the globe, refusing a single idiom or tide, idles mean abstracted streets and lives off scraps the sated throw away. Our words are made of plastic now and end up in the sea, where stocks of wisdom, overfished and toxic with cliché, dwindle and cease. So what will there be left for us to say by way of remorse? What elegy, excuse or prayer, when the sands along subtropic shores have grown so warm that no more male turtles hatch and make it to the sea? And who will we be, our language atrophied a little more, when Norfolk parakeets run out of trees to roost and fledge? And what will we grasp any more of sin, when all the devils that we know have slipped the earth? And who will teach desire grace, or passion poise, when nothing burns the forests of the night? And when the last savannah elephant has scattered all the bones, what will we recall of grief when our turn comes to let our dear ones go? And how will all the plastic that will never go extinct school the seas in sanctity? What sense will awe begin to make when no blue whales swim the world around? And will our minds remember how to slow our speeding chill when all the whale sharks have passed? Sea otter, snow leopard, curlew, bee, divinity will be burlesque, and joy will be a sham, when all these bodhisattvas of the floating, hungry, thrumming world have left. O person of the forest, orangutan, who might be any one of us who came down once from boughs, teach us, while there are still woods to be, how to be the woods, not just the trees.
You've been listening to the Lit Poetry Podcast, presented by James Laidler. For more podcasts, poetry videos, and other useful resources, visit our website at www.litpoetry.com. Thanks for listening.